All right, well, welcome everybody. It's great to see everyone. It looks like most everybody's made their way in and is getting audio connected here. It's really lovely to see your faces. And as always, I encourage you to have your cameras on. It looks like most everybody does. If for any reason you're not able to or not comfortable having your camera on, that's fine. But I do intend this as a conversation. So welcome, I'm Micah Streiffer. I am a rabbi and the founder of La'asok. La'asok is a virtual Beit Midrash, a house of study that brings together learners to study Jewish texts from a progressive, inclusive perspective. Many of you are already involved in various kinds of classes and learning at La'asok, and so I'm glad to see all of you again. And for those who are new to our programming, welcome for the first time, and excited to have this conversation with you and discuss with you. I'm going to share my screen here, and in just a moment we will jump in. Is everyone able to see my screen? Okay, perfect. Before we jump in, let me just mention a couple of upcoming classes that might be of interest, especially starting in July. I've got a couple of classes that I think will, if you have the time for them, will be really interesting. In July, we're going to do 3 sessions on Abraham Joshua Heschel. We're going to meet Heschel today. He's a rabbi and a thinker, and we're going to talk about his view of prophecy and social justice. So if you like Heschel today and you're interested in delving in more, that'll be really interesting coming up July 11th. As well, starting July 5th, and for 4 weeks in a row on Wednesdays, I'm going to be doing a class that's called O Jerusalem, the 3,000-year story of a city and a symbol. It's really about the history of the meaning of Jerusalem, as opposed to the history of Jerusalem per se, although we'll touch on that. Finally, one more of these sort of one-shot community conversations like we're doing here is on Friday, July 14th at 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. So to get ready for Shabbat, we're going to talk about Lecha Dodi, the Friday night song Lecha Dodi, in a session I'm calling Shabbat, Sexuality, and Tikkun Olam in Lecha Dodi. So you may know the song, you may not know what it's about. You didn't know that it was actually both erotic poetry and also about Tikkun Olam at the same time. So we'll talk about that next month. All of that has gone out and will go again out again through La'asok. So I hope you can join me for some or all of those upcoming programs. So now we're going to say the blessing for study, and we'll jump into our conversation. If you're comfortable doing so, you can unmute yourself and just step a little bit back from your microphone so we can hear each other and we can bless together. And join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the one whose mitzvot, whose commandments bring holiness to our lives, and who has commanded to immerse ourselves, to engage ourselves in words of Torah. That, of course, is the meaning of the word la'asok. La'asok means to immerse or to engage, and that's what we're here to do, to immerse ourselves, to soak ourselves up in words of Torah. So our discussion for today, the fixed and the fluid, which is actually my imperfect translation of the Hebrew words Keva and Kavanah. And we'll talk in a bit about what that means and what these different aspects of prayer are. We're talking here about making Jewish prayer meaningful. So to begin, I want to invite you to think about a moment or an experience in your life that was a meaningful prayer experience. It doesn't have to be traditional prayer, although it can be traditional prayer, but some moment that to you felt both meaningful and prayerful. I'll invite you, even if you're comfortable, close your eyes and sort of put yourself in that moment for just a second. Think about what was meaningful about it and where you were, who you were with, etc. Okay. Now, I'd like to ask you to think about words that describe that moment and to put them into the chat. What was meaningful? Using, words or short phrases. Let's put them in the chat. How would you describe this moment and what made it meaningful? Great. I see some words starting to pop up in the chat. I'll read through them here. So I see warm and fulfilling, being as one with others. Others there, Debbie and Rick, I think that's Debbie. I assume you're talking about other people, right? Rachel talks about connection with God. So we have connection in two directions here, right? Connection sort of horizontally with others, connection, what we might call vertically, between ourselves and God in whatever way we imagine or conceive of God. Belonging and connection, I see peaceful, I see joyful, I see emotional, I see peaceful again, awe-inspiring. That's a really important word, that word awe or yirah. Peaceful and undistracted. Sanctuary, in the sanctuary with my Ojai family, that of course being your congregational family. We have a few people from that congregation here, right? It's moving in a certain place and also with a certain group of people. And then I see powerful, engaging, earthly, and grounded. And then an apology. No problem. You don't have to apologize there. Everybody's spiritual life is a little different. So I see a whole variety of words here. Some of them have to do with how we connect with others. Some of them have to do with a connection with God. Some of them have to do with how it feels, the sense of peace, the sense of awe, whole variety of words. I want to invite us to go a little deeper. Maybe there's, a couple of people here who are willing to share a little more in terms of what was the experience that you're describing and what was meaningful about it. And I'll actually start. The experience that I had in mind was one where I was alone, all by myself in nature. And I was in some of you might have heard me describe this before in various classes, in the Himalayan mountains. I had stopped at a guest house and had arrived the previous evening in the dark. And in the morning when I woke up, I walked outside the door of the guest house and I was just struck by this Himalayan scene, mountains, clouds. It was immense and it was beautiful and it was awe-inspiring. And it's interesting that in that moment, I actually was moved to put on my tefillin. Now, I don't put on tefillin every day. I do own tefillin and I like it when I put them on, but I'm not like a daily tefillin putter oner. But I do take them with me wherever I go. I'm one of those Jews that always takes their tefillin in case they decide to put them on somewhere. And standing in this moment of awe, I felt moved to prayer because I felt so awe-inspired in that moment, standing there all by myself. So I wonder, does, one or two people, if you're willing, you can put up your electronic hand and just very briefly tell us about what was your moment and what was meaningful about it. I see Vanix, either Joy or Peter.
Two opposite experiences. One is when we were at the Grand Canyon, and very similar to your Himalayan experience, where you sort of look out over the vastness of the Grand Canyon, and you see and you feel the awfulness, the presence of God. And the other is I guess a sorrowful one, where we had experienced a tragedy, and we were sitting in the sanctuary with the rabbi, and it felt like, and we felt like being comforted by just sitting in the sanctuary with the rabbi.
Great, thank you. And you called those opposite, and in a way they are, but I just want to point out that the word awe, we talk about awful and awesome as being two different things, but they both have awe in them, right? Awe is that sense of being in touch with something larger than ourselves. And sometimes it's awful and sometimes it's awesome, but both of those have the potential to connect us. So we'll just take two more. I see Sarah and then I see Anne, and then we're going to jump into a text that can begin to give us some context here. Go ahead, Sarah.
So my experience was probably like at my first Shabbat service, because I'm a conversion student, so I didn't start going to services until my late 20s. And it was the Pride Shabbat, and it was just like so radically different from any other kind of spiritual gathering I had ever been to in my life. And it was just nice to like be able to be my whole self with others who were also being authentically them, like in the presence of God.
Wonderful, thank you. Sarah, would you use the word belonging and connection there?
Yes.
It sounds to me like what I think I'm hearing you say is sort of that I could belong fully as my authentic self, right?
Yes. Yeah, those are actually the words I put in the chat. Yeah, because I'd always felt like not able to tune in when I was going to like Southern Baptist services growing up, and I think it just kind of like removed the block in a way.
Mhm. Great,
So.
thank you for sharing that. Anne, go ahead.
There are times during Shabbat where rather than sing the Mishaberach, we chant it in front of the ark. And those moments where we're all saying that ancient prayer, because now it's become modern because Debbie Friedman said it's music, but it really is an old prayer. And when you chant it, you really feel like those people who are ill, that God is hearing those prayers.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to point out the differences of experience that we heard in these examples given. The Grand Canyon experience is in many ways a very solitary experience. It's also in nature, looking out over the world and feeling a sense of awe that this world exists. The sitting with the rabbi after a tragedy experience is actually one of being in the presence of a comforting person. Several of you then talked about a community of connection, a community of authenticity. And then Anne, you added the dimension of past generations, that idea that I'm doing something that people have been doing, that my ancestors have been doing. So these are all different sources of connection in various directions. And what we're going to see as we move to this next text is that actually these are things that Jews have been thinking about for a really long time. So this is actually, this is not the text I thought I was doing, but it's worth looking at him anyway. This is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and he has this to say about prayer. He says, public worship is an act of the highest importance. However, it tends in our days to become a spectacle in which the congregation remains passive, inert spectators. But prayer is action. It requires complete mobilization of the heart, mind, and soul. What is the worth of attending public worship when mind and soul are not involved? So I think he's pointing up a problem that we have here. All of you raised these really amazing moments of prayer, many of which were spontaneous or surrounded by people where you felt connected. Heschel points up a problem, which is that often our prayer, our formal prayer experiences become, what does he call it? Passive and spectator. Have you ever been in a sanctuary or in a synagogue and you thought, do I even need to be here? Right? Like they're performing for me. I'm showing up, I'm not here as a prayer. I'm here as something else, something different. The question then becomes, how do we go about making our prayer experiences into what you've all described previously? And I think we can turn to this text from the Talmud for some help with this. So this is found in Tractate Brachot. Brachot is the tractate of the Talmud that deals with blessings. Brachot means blessings in Hebrew. And we have here a disagreement between two rabbis. The rabbis are Rabbi Yosei, son of Hanina, and Rabbi Joshua or Yehoshua ben Levi. So we're in the 4th century here, Babylonia, and we have two rabbis arguing over something. They say, Rabbi Yosei, son of Hanina, said, the patriarchs established the prayers. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, or son of Levi, said, the prayers were established according to the sacrifices in the temple. It is taught according to Rabbi Yossi, son of Hanina, and it is taught according to Rabbi Joshua ben Levi. Okay, what are these two rabbis arguing about? What are they disagreeing about? Anybody know? What they're disagreeing about, if we were in the same room, I'm sure I could hear what you're all muttering. What they're disagreeing about here is the question of why do we pray 3 times a day? Jews traditionally pray 3 times a day, right? Morning, afternoon, evening. And they have 2 different versions of why it is that we pray 3 times a day. Now, here's one little piece of Talmudic logic you need to know, which is that in the Talmud, the earlier the better. If you have some kind of proof to prove your statement, and it's an old one, like if it comes from the 1st century, and I have a proof that comes from the 4th century, then you win, because the rabbis believe that the closer somebody is to Sinai, to the giving of the Torah, the more likely they are to essentially be right, to understand Torah and Judaism. So the problem here is that both of these guys have a proof from the same period, where it says here, it is taught. Well, I didn't mean to do that. It is taught. The Hebrew is actually Aramaic is Tanya. Tanya means this is a piece of Talmudic literature that comes from the 1st or 2nd century. That's quite old. And if you notice, it says it is taught according to Rabbi Yossi, and it is taught according to Rabbi Joshua ben Levi. In other words, they both have a perfectly good, very old proof for their argument. So let's look at their proofs, and we'll see what we have to learn from them. All right, it is taught according to Rabbi Yossi, son of Chanina. Remember, he said that the patriarchs established the 3 daily prayer services. Here's how he does it. He says, Abraham established the morning prayer. As it is written, Abraham woke up early in the morning and went to the place where he had stood. This is from the book of Genesis, from the day after Abraham argues with God over Sodom and Gomorrah. It says, Abraham woke up early and went and stood in that place. Now, it sounds like Abraham's just standing there, right? But the rabbis read it differently. They say, and standing must refer to prayer, as it is written in the book of Psalms, and Pinchas stood and prayed, judged, in the word vayipalel. So obviously, if standing, you have to follow my Talmudic logic here. If standing refers to praying back in Psalms, then in Genesis, it must also refer to praying. So when Abraham got up in the morning and stood there, what was he doing? He wasn't just standing there. Obviously, he was davening shachrit. He was saying the morning service, right? Everybody, I know you all believe this, right? So Abraham established the morning service. We pray a morning service because of Abraham. Okay, Isaac established the afternoon service, as it is written, and Isaac went out to converse in the fields as evening was falling. This is right before Isaac and Rebekah meet each other for the first time. Rebekah's on her way home, or on her way to meet Isaac, and she sees that Isaac is sort of out in the fields conversing, talking, but it doesn't say who he's talking to. Who's Isaac talking to? Well, the rabbis say converse must refer to prayer, because it says in Psalms, before God let him pour out his conversation. So obviously Isaac was not just talking to himself in the field, he was davening mincha. He was saying the afternoon service, right? In this moment, right before he's about to meet his new spouse, he was out talking to God, and that's why we say an afternoon service. Okay, Jacob established the evening service. As it is written, he approached the place and slept there. Vayifga b'makom. This is right before Jacob has his very famous dream of the ladder. He's running away from his family. His brother Esau has threatened to kill him. He's trying to get the heck out of there as quickly as he can. And it says, Vayifga b'makom. He came upon a place and he slept there. And he had this incredible dream where God says to him, I will be with you wherever you go. I will always stay with you. The rabbis say this approach must refer to prayer, because in the book of Jeremiah, it refers to approaching God. So obviously what Jacob is doing is davening Mariv. He's saying the evening service. There you have it. Abraham established the morning service. Isaac established the afternoon service. Jacob established the evening service. That's why we Jews pray 3 times a day. Okay, next argument. It is taught according to Rabbi Joshua ben Levi. Why has it been said that the morning service can be said until noon? Because the morning sacrifice could be performed until noon. We're talking here about the sacrifices in the ancient temple. Why has it been said that the afternoon service can be said until evening? Because the twilight sacrifice could be performed until evening. And why has it been said that the evening service has no specified time? Because the burning of limbs and fats that were not consumed by evening continued all night. In other words, our morning service exists because there was a morning sacrifice and this replaced it. Our afternoon service exists because there was an afternoon evening sacrifice and this replaced it. Our evening service exists because of the holy act of eating the meat from the sacrifice, which went on in the evening and all night long, and this replaced it. So we have two different versions, two different historical arguments for why we pray 3 times a day. One says the 3 patriarchs, each in some important moment of his life, established a service, established a prayer, and that's why. The other says it's because there were sacrifices and these replaced the sacrifices. So let me ask you a question. Which one do you like better? Which one resonates with you? Let's put it into the chat. You can either put patriarchs or sacrifices. Tell us which one you like better. And then, of course, I'm going to make you tell me why.
Eric's 100%.
All right, I see a vote for sacrifice. Any other votes? You don't have to put the why into the chat. We can talk about that. I believe the patriarch, prefer the patriarch, but believe the sacrifice. All right, I see more for patriarchs. Oh, yeah, it's a pretty even split here, right? Okay, so let's talk about why. Why did you vote the way you do? Why did you prefer the way that the one that you chose? Anybody want to raise your hand electronically and tell us? And yes, Sarah, you can like whichever one you want. Robert, I thought I saw your hand go up. Was I imagining that? Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, so the patriarch one is a nicer one because it establishes tradition and it makes the stories meaningful. But I tend to buy into the sacrifice one because it makes more sense that these ancient rituals would have been 3 times daily.
Okay.
These animals.
Okay, great. Anne, go ahead.
I think the story of the patriarchs is far more meaningful. We don't even have sacrifices anymore, but we still tell these stories as we're supposed to over and over.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're finding meaning in the patriarch story here because these are stories we continue to tell. Dawn, what do you think?
I think both resonate for reasons about why we pray. So the concrete idea of why we pray is here, but it doesn't really tell us how we should pray. And that's the problem I'm having. It's not about why we pray 3 times a day. We can have either case fit our narrative. But the issue I have is not why or when, but how we should. And that's the issue I'm having with probably all of this.
Mm-hmm.
So you can take that as you will. I'm sorry to be the fly in the ointment, but that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah. So tell me more about what is it when you say the how, what are you looking for more of?
Well, in a modern context, I understand why we pray 3 times a day or why we pray. But trying to find meaning in prayer in a 21st century world where God becomes far more distant for us is difficult for me personally. And I speak as both a congregant or as a former prayer leader, trying to find God in what we have established as prayer, either through our communal prayers or our personal prayer, is very challenging for me. It's just for me. And even if I stand up in front of a group of people and try and lead them in prayer, I feel like I'm a fraud at times. So I don't know the answers to these questions. I'm just putting them out there.
Yeah, so it's interesting, Dawn. One of the things that I'm hearing from you, and you and I are both prayer leaders, we've led prayer together, right? Is this, I think one of the things that resonates about the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob stories here is that it feels so personal. You stand before God, right? But the stories that we tell in the Torah are stories of people that God talks to, right? So it's easy to stand in prayer when just yesterday you were having a conversation with God right here in this place. It's maybe harder when in a world where God doesn't talk to you in the same way, or where maybe I don't resonate with the idea of a personal God in the way that Abraham was talking to. So in the real world, then I think, and we'll get to this, the question is, what is the purpose of prayer? So the why and the how kind of merge here in a sense, right? Because when we talked about what was meaningful about prayer, we actually talked about the various sources of connection that we experienced through prayer. And what I want us to see through this text that we just looked at, and looking at these two pictures, right? You have a patriarch picture and you have a temple picture, is that they are presenting very different pictures or very different ways of thinking about what is meaningful about prayer. The patriarch stories are spontaneous, they're personal, they're individual, they are context dependent, which is to say I'm experiencing something momentous right here, right now, because of something that's going on. It is easy to resonate with that. Those resonate for us because those are the moments where I think we often feel something meaningful. The temple story is actually harder to resonate with because it feels, what's the word I'm looking for? Corporate, institutional, right? So also, I mean, I'm a vegetarian. I don't resonate with animal sacrifice very easily. I know some of you are vegetarians also, right? So there's something corporate and institutional and sort of old feeling about that. But I think the other element to notice is, what is the temple that the patriarch stories are not? It's communal, it's connective, it's people coming together to participate in something. So we have here a set of stories that talk about prayer as something personal, individual, spontaneous that I do in this moment. And we have a set of stories that talk about prayer as something that we all do, all together at the same time, every year, year after year. And these, I think, are actually two very important, different sides of the same coin, which brings us to the idea of Keva and Kavanah, that there are elements of prayer that are fixed and established and communal, and there are elements of prayer that are personal and intentional and fluid and individual. And when we described our meaningful prayer moments toward the beginning of the discussion, we actually described elements of both of these. Some of us said it was when I was standing looking at the Grand Canyon by myself and I felt awe-inspired. And some of us said it was when I was sitting with somebody else and they were offering me comfort. Actually, it was the same person who said both of those things, right? Or it was when I was surrounded by my congregational community singing a song that we all love together. So in a moment, I'm going to sort of unfairly pit these against each other, but you'll see why I'm doing that. But before we do that, I see a couple of comments. Go ahead, Anne, and then Olivia.
I think intent is an enormous issue here. And there's different prayers. You have personal prayers and liturgical prayers. And in the Torah, every word has meaning. So in the beginning, you're called to listen. You're called either by saying Shema or by the shofar. And in listening, you hear. And each word has meaning. Every word in Torah has meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're praying with intent and with feeling, it's a different type of experience completely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Anne. So there's something that we bring to the experience, right? Olivia, I think, was next.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. It's more of a sidestep now because it was very much on why I felt more connected to, I guess, the patriarch notion. I think from this is maybe a little bit more showing the Orthodox notions that I grew up with, but I think if we think of our patriarchs as God's intermediaries, then if we want to emulate his ways, then we thereby emulate their ways and try sort of to do as they did, which is why it seems so much more meaningful to do that than to do these somewhat barbaric feeling sacrifices, right?
Yeah, fair enough. And I think, the idea that the patriarchs are the originators of our tradition, right? We stand on the shoulders of and we stand in the footsteps of generations upon generations of people who have come before us and done the same things as us. I think is a very meaningful practice. And, and we actually know that there's truth to that idea. Not Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I can't prove them historically, but we can show that Jews have been saying the Shema for 3,000 years, right? We do know that Jews have been saying the Amidah, the daily standing prayer, for 2,000 years. We know that because the rabbis list some of these prayers in the Talmud, right? The earliest prayer books we have come from about maybe 1,100 years ago. And they are, I mean, the earliest prayer book we have actually was written, now I'm going to, of course, forget, a Seder Rav Amram by Rav Amram Gaon, 9th century Babylonian leader, who the Jews of Spain wrote to him saying, hey, Rabbi, what should we be saying in our prayer service? And he wrote them back a whole prayer book. And it's 1,100 years old, and it has a lot of the same words that our prayer book has in it today, which means that when you stand up and you say the Ahava Rabbah blessing, or sit down as the case may be, you are saying the same words that Jews have been saying for a very, very long time. And that is nothing to sneeze at. That is something that we can find great connectivity in as Jews, that we are doing what Jews have always done. So I want to go back to Heschel now. He says there is a specific difficulty in Jewish prayer. There are laws, how to pray, when to pray, what to pray. There are fixed times, fixed ways, fixed text. On the other hand, prayer is worship of the heart, the outpouring of the soul, a matter of kavanah, or inner devotion. Anne just mentioned that, right? The intention that you bring. Thus, Jewish prayer is guided by two opposite principles: order and outburst, regularity and spontaneity, uniformity and individuality, law and freedom, duty and prerogative, empathy and self-expression, insight and sensitivity, creed and faith, the word and that which is beyond words. These principles are the two poles about which Jewish prayer revolves. And now, as promised, I'm going to unfairly pit these against each other. Okay. How much time do I have? Do I want to do these two texts? Yeah, I do have time. All right. So we're not pitting them against each other yet. I want to show you one text from the Talmud and one from the Hasidic masters that show us that this tension has been around for a very long time. Both of these coincidentally have to do with a rabbi named Nachman, different Nachmans. So in the 4th century sometime, Rabbi Yitzchak notices that his colleague Rav Nachman has not been in shul lately. And he goes to him and he says, I'm right here. Why did you not come to the synagogue to pray? Rav Nachman says, I was unable because I was weak or sick, Rashi tells us. Rav Yitzchak says, oh, well, then you should gather 10 people together and pray. Like, that's a minyan, right? You need 10 people to pray. Rav Nachman says, no, that's hard for me. I'm sick, I'm contagious, I'm weak. For some reason, he doesn't want to do that. Rabbi Yitzchak suggests, well, then, the master, meaning you, should ask the congregation to send a messenger at the time when the congregation is praying to come and inform you so that you can pray at the same time. In other words, it's really important that you pray with the community and at the very least at the same time as the community. Rav Nachman says to him, what is all this? Like, what's the big deal here? And Rabbi Yitzchak says to him, it is as my teacher taught me, I'm right here, what is the meaning of that which is written? As for me, let my prayer be unto you, God, in a time of favor. What is a time of favor? It refers to a time when the congregation is praying. So the rabbis of the Talmud tell us that there's something about praying together with other people that brings out God's favor. In other words, God is more favorable toward communal prayer when we pray with others, when we pray the same words as others, when we pray in a community, when we pray connected with each other, so much so that if Rav Nachman is sick, he should at the very least pray at the same time as the congregation, even if he can't be with them. By the way, another time we'll have a conversation about this as the precursor to the Zoom minyan, right? During COVID, when we couldn't actually be together, Many of us were jumping on Zoom and praying together with a virtual community. This text right here is the first inkling of the idea of a virtual minyan, that you don't have to be in the room to at least have some sense of connection. It does show us that the rabbis believe that God is more present somehow when we are with other people, when we are connected to each other, praying the same words as each other, than when we're on our own. However, here's another Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, the very great 18th century Hasidic Rebbe, whose student, Rab Nosson of Bratslav, wrote this poem based on the teachings of his rabbi, Rabbi Nachman, who used to go pray by himself in the field every day, all by himself. He writes, "Master of the universe, grant me the ability to be alone. May it be my custom to go outdoors each day among the trees and grass, among all the growing things, and there may I be alone and enter into prayer, to talk with the one to whom I belong. May I express there everything in my heart, and may all the foliage of the field, all the grasses, trees, and plants awaken at my coming, to send the powers of their life into the words of my prayer, so that my prayer and speech are made whole through the life and spirit of all growing things, which are made as one by their transcendent source. May I pour out the words of my heart before your presence like water, O God, and lift up my hands to you in worship on my behalf and that of my children." In other words, Rav Nachman is saying something like, yeah, okay, I'll pray with the minyan because I know I need to, but where I really connect with God is out there in nature on my own, all by myself. And so I think this shows us that this has been a very old tension in Judaism between how we're supposed to pray. Am I supposed to pray together with others? Am I supposed to pray on my own? Am I supposed to connect in individual and very personal ways with God, as it says here? Or am I supposed to connect using words that actually others are using as well? Is it more meaningful to pray in Hebrew because all Jews pray in Hebrew? Or is it more meaningful to use words that I said myself that express what's personal in my heart? And I think we have a tension here that's been going on for a very long time. Peter and Joy, go ahead. You have some thoughts about that?
I'm just wondering if I can't comment about conservative or Orthodox Judaism because I don't know, but I'm just wondering if Reform practice of communal prayer hasn't tried to reconcile the two of those things by inserting in the service a time for silent prayer, a time for I think it's called Tefillat Halev, the prayer of the heart.
Yeah, and I think that traditional practice does that as well. You know, in a traditional setting, an Orthodox or conservative setting, you say the Amidah once by yourself silently, and then you say it again as a community. Now, there's not a prescription there that you should say whatever's in your heart, but there is a kind of an individual moment and then followed by a communal moment. And we also have passages in the Talmud, again in Tractate Brachot, that tell us that are compositions by some of the Talmudic rabbis of what they used to say after their tefillah. That is to say, they used to have some other more personal prayer that they would say after completing their tefillah. But so yeah, Anne, go ahead.
I agree with Vanix, but also I would mention, is he really alone? If we're all God's creation, is this rabbi in nature really alone? So that's my question.
Yeah, I like that you're all finding ways to sort of reconcile these. Before we reconcile them, I'm actually going to drive them further apart because I'm going to make you choose. So, all right. You have to choose A or B, and no, you can't say neither. All right? And I know this is totally unfair. Is it more meaningful to you to put it in the chat? A, recite an ancient Jewish prayer, or B, write your own original prayer? see a lot of A and a little B. All right, it's a bit of a mix. All right, so I saw more A than B, but not 100%. So somebody just tell us why you voted for what you voted for. Anybody willing to share? Yeah, Stephanie, go ahead.
Thank you. In our congregation, either led by clergy or by Sheila Cohen, our past president, and this last week by Rebbe Rick Bloom, we always have the traditional prayers, but then there's a time when we recite or say our own individually to ourselves. It's about 3 or 4 minutes. And I find what I say in my heart to be much more meaningful because I'm mentioning certain people or certain things, whereas reciting an ancient prayer is a connection to the past. And so I really like both.
Yeah, fair
And-
enough. And
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I wonder then if the reason that the individual prayer can take on that meaning is because you're already standing in the midst of a community that's praying together using ancient words, right?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that, Stephanie. Others, why did you vote the way you voted? All right, well, let's go on to the next one then. Not done being unfair to you. Is it more meaningful to A, pray in English, or B, pray in Hebrew? I see a couple of English. I see one Hebrew. All right, if it's okay if I pick on somebody, Robert, why did you say Hebrew? You can always tell me no, by the way.
No, I said Hebrew for the same reason. I chose the ancient Jewish prayer because I feel that the ancient language and the ancient prayer is something that's in our DNA, and the act of prayer is to awaken that. And so if we're searching for spirituality, it's a deeper place than the superficial. When we write our own things or say our own things in English, that I seem to feel that they're clouded by our daily lives and that they're not as truly original as we might want them to believe. Whereas if we go to the ancient, it's sort of mystical and mysterious.
Hmm.
And so we're reaching for something that's other, but also something that's deeply within. I especially believe that for Jews, who most of whom came from Eastern Europe and have familial trauma, that when you go back to those original prayers, you're somehow, in worshiping the ancestors, you're somehow healing the trauma that they had that was perhaps unknown and subconsciously passed down to you as well.
Yeah, so prayer then isn't just something in Judaism that we do alone, right? It's something we do together with a community somehow. And that community might be a physical one that we're standing with, but it might also be a community of generations that we're part of. And it references this idea in the book of Deuteronomy, where it says that we enter into covenant not only with those who are standing here, but also with those who are not standing here. In other words, that idea that we all stand at Mount Sinai together. Somehow our prayer is an expression of this peoplehood, right? So I see a couple other hands. I see Dawn, and then I see Stephanie.
I think it depends on the prayer you're using. I think a prayer that you do from your heart probably resonates more in your vernacular, whatever in my case, English. But I think it's also odd to hear certain prayers in English. When you stand at the grave with mourners and they say Kaddish, we hand them cards to help them through speak, the Aramaic of Kaddish. I find the Shema in Hebrew resonates far more personally than the Shema in English. So I think it really is determined by what the prayer is and what the prayer is saying,
Mhm.
and the occasion for the prayer.
Yeah, thank you, Don. And the Kaddish is actually a really interesting example because the Kaddish, the reason the Kaddish is in Aramaic is that Aramaic in, go back 1500 years ago, was the language that most people understood. So the Kaddish was written in Aramaic so that we could understand it. It would be like if today we said the Kaddish needs to be in English so that you can understand what you're saying. The irony now is that far fewer of us even understand Aramaic than Hebrew, which means that the language of the Kaddish is actually the least accessible language in the entire prayer book. And yet it wouldn't feel right, I think, to a lot of us to say it in English, because the Kaddish has this power by which I think we feel like we are connecting with generations past by saying these ancient words. So it's funny how meaning can shift there, that the Kaddish is actually maybe shifted from the Kavanah side to the Keva side, in the sense that we have come to say this prayer in a way that is much more about the words and the ancient generations than about the actual meaning of it, whereas it was probably originally written in Aramaic so that people could understand it. I saw Stephanie, and then I saw Peter and Joy.
I feel not, I grew up Jewish. My parents, my grandparents all were Jewish, but we never said the prayers in Hebrew because the children could not understand. So when I read the English translation in my prayer book, it makes it easier to understand the prayer in Hebrew. Without that knowledge, the prayers are meaningless to me because I'm just saying words that I don't understand. So for me, praying in English or just seeing the words and then pray in Hebrew, which we do both in our congregation, just made a lot more sense to me. So I have meaning now when I say the prayers in Hebrew because I understand what they mean.
Great. Yeah, and so then we're bringing but you're also saying ancient prayers at the same time, right? So we're bringing our own sense of understanding and intentionality to this very ancient set of traditions that have been handed down to us, that are deeply communal. Peter and Joy.
I want to comment on what Don said and how you picked up on Kaddish, it being Aramaic, it not being Hebrew, it being the language of the vernacular of the day. And we have to understand that when we look at the prayer in English, it's somebody's idea of what the prayer means. In other words, translation isn't accurate ever. So that's the first thing. But I think Kaddish is a special case. And the reason it's a special case is because its significance to us has absolutely no bearing on the translation. I can't translate it directly, but basically it magnifies the glory of God and all that sort of stuff. But that's not what it means to us. It's a prayer of remembrance to us. Whether that's what the translation is all about or not is irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Kaddish is sort of a unique example because I think it has gone so far from the one side to the other. It has gone and from almost entirely from being a prayer that you needed to understand, which is why it was written in Aramaic, to being a prayer whose meaning, the literal meaning of the words, almost doesn't matter at all. Because the point of the Kaddish is we say it to remember people. We say it using these ancient words. We all, I just recently, I was in touch with an old friend who was leading a funeral, unfortunately, for his grandfather. He's not, particularly Jewishly involved, but he was the one who was sort of designated to lead the funeral. And he asked me to, show him how to do it. So he said, and I don't know Hebrew. He said, I can't read Hebrew. So, I showed him the various prayers. And then I said, oh, and then end with Kaddish. And if you can't do the Kaddish in Aramaic, then you can say it in English, although it's best to say it in Aramaic. And he said, oh, Kaddish? That I know. We know the Kaddish, most of us, even if we don't know how to read Hebrew, even if we don't know most of the rest of the prayers, we know the Kaddish because it's not about the meaning per se. That is to say, the ritual takes on a different meaning. And the meaning there of the ritual is one, we could say what it is. It's about remembrance. It's about connecting with past generations. It's about being surrounded by supportive community, which I think, to your point, Peter, has almost nothing to do with the actual meaning of the words of the Kaddish. So the Kaddish is a sort of an outlying example because it sits at the perimeter of these two poles, what Heschel calls these two poles of Jewish prayer, whereas almost everything else we do is somehow a blending of these two, which I think brings us back to our original question, which is what makes prayer meaningful? And if we go back through the answers, we find that prayer has a whole variety of purposes. What's meaningful about prayer is, we might think it's about understanding the words and saying things that we mean, but that would only be one piece of it. It also has to do with how we connect with other people. It also has to do with how we connect with our ancestors. The Kaddish is the best example of that, right? It doesn't matter what I'm saying, but there are some instances where prayer is very much about what I'm saying and what I mean and what it means to me. Sometimes prayer is about what I want to say in my heart, which is very different from a moment where prayer is much more about how I am together with other people. So if I can turn back to Heschel one more time, he says prayer serves many aims. It serves to save the inward life from oblivion. It serves to alleviate anguish. It serves to partake of God's mysterious grace and guidance. Yet ultimately, prayer must not be experienced as an act for the sake of something else. We pray in order to pray. So I think what Heschel is saying here is something along the lines of that meaningful prayer, what is meaningful about prayer, might actually change from moment to moment. There's some moments where what I need is to alleviate anguish. And then prayer can bring that to me, but only in a certain context. There are some moments where what I need is to partake of God's mysterious grace and guidance. In other words, I need to say to you, God, what's in my heart at this moment. And saying the Ve'ahavta may not do it for me. I need to say to you what I'm thinking, what I'm praying. And for that, I may need to not be surrounded by other people. I don't know exactly what he means to save the inward life from oblivion, but it sounds like something we all need, right? In other words, what is meaningful about prayer is actually much more about what I'm going through at a given moment and what the needs of the self and the community are in any given moment, which I think leads me to my final text. And with this, we'll end. Not this one, that one's really long. We'll skip that one. Here we go. This is by Rabbi Ferdinand Isserman. This, by the way, often attributed to Heschel, but it's not Heschel. Prayer invites God's presence to suffuse our spirits, God's will to prevail in our lives. Prayer may not bring water to parched fields, nor mend a broken bridge, nor rebuild a ruined city, but prayer can water an arid soul, mend a broken heart, and rebuild a weakened will. Which is to say that prayer being meaningful is much more about how it moves us than about how it moves the world. I can't rebuild a bridge, a physical bridge through prayer, but I can actually rebuild myself. And then I can go out and rebuild that bridge. I can't bring rain through prayer, but I can water my own soul, and then go out and help do things that will make the world a better place. So I think my final question for all of you in the couple of minutes we have left, and this can be either for the chat or if anybody wants to raise their hands, which is, what do we need to bring in order for prayer to be meaningful? Any thoughts on this last question? Yes, Joy and Peter, go ahead.
I think you have to bring yourself in all of its parts, your emotions, your logic. You have to bring yourself to the prayer. And if you do that, I don't think it makes a difference if you're praying within a community or you're praying on a bench in a park, then it becomes meaningful.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful idea. Can you tell us more, Joy? What does it look like to do that, to bring your whole self in that way?
I think very often when people, certainly within a community, when they're sitting in the congregation, they're not really there. They're physically there, but they're not really there. They're thinking about their kids. They're thinking about work. They're thinking about what they have to do in the afternoon. You can't have meaningful prayer if you're not all there while you're there.
Mm-hmm.
And again, even when you go for a walk in a park, you're not necessarily looking at the flowers or marveling at the height of a tree or sometimes I look out our window, we have a beautiful view of trees, and I think, oh my God, there's all these trees, and look, they're not all the same green. They're all green, but it's all multicolored green. So it's how you put yourself in the moment. You can't be somewhere else if you're praying.
Great. It's that commitment to be in the moment, right? And what you do in the moment can differ, right? But to be in the moment somehow. Anne, go ahead.
It's just another variant of that, but it gives you time to put a period in it, a next paragraph, to hear life and your place in it, to just take that pause, that period, and make it work for you.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. I know we're out of time here and we're not going to look at this whole text, but what you all are saying actually makes me think, this is Rabbi Shmuel Berezovsky, who's the leader of a Hasidic sect. He says that prayer is always Shabbat. In other words, when you enter into prayer, you actually are creating Shabbat wherever and whenever you are. And what is Shabbat? Shabbat is the opportunity to be in the moment. Now, here's the thing about this, and here's a little bit of pushback to what the last couple people said, which is I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves. And the pressure is like, oh, I've got to be like focused on the words. I got to know what I'm saying. I got to mean it. I got to, this or that. I got to stop worrying about what I'm worrying about. Being in the moment actually means noticing what you're thinking. It doesn't mean directing what you're thinking. It means noticing what I'm worried about, where I am, what are my needs in a given moment. And sometimes our needs in a given moment actually are to sit and worry about what I'm worried about, but to do it in the community, right? Sometimes the needs of what, sometimes we are distracted. And I think sometimes to allow ourselves to get lost in the music, to simply be surrounded by other people. So if we understand that prayer serves this wide variety of different purposes, then we actually can take some of the pressure off ourselves to do it right, quote unquote, right. Because it turns out that actually to pray in a meaningful way has much more to do with where we are in a given moment than with actually doing something in a given way. And when we talk about Keva and Kavanah, when we talk about the fixed and the fluid, I think it's a reminder to us that there's not a right way to do it. There is simply the way that waters our soul in a given moment based on where we are and what we need in that moment. So I want to thank all of you for this discussion. I love these texts and I loved hearing your take on all of this and what it means to you. And again, thank you for participating and for bearing your souls and opening up your thoughts and minds to this conversation.